Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Summit of Minds. High Counselor Praxin Doric had negotiated border wars, mining crises, succession disputes, and once an argument over the ownership of a moon that 3 species had accidentally colonized at the same time. None of those negotiations had frightened him as much as the Orison Cascade. The problem itself was simple enough to explain. The galaxy's long-range transit anchors were linked through subspace. Each anchor stabilized the next, producing an interwoven navigation network that allowed ships to cross distances that conventional drives could not bridge safely. For 4 centuries, the system had worked. Then one anchor near the Orison Rift began oscillating. The oscillation spread. One network picked it up, then another, until dozens of anchor clusters were feeding energy back into the same instability. Engineers predicted that if the major powers disconnected their networks within the same narrow window, the resonance would collapse harmlessly. If they disconnected at different times, however, the remaining anchors would inherit the load. Some would fail. A few might fail violently. Hundreds of inhabited systems depended on those anchors, which was why every significant transit power in the Galactic Union had sent representatives to the emergency summit on Xylos. Praxin stood at the central dais beneath a ceiling of dark crystal while 300 delegates negotiated around him. He had presided over emergency sessions before, but never one in which every government's safest choice became dangerous unless everyone else made the same choice at nearly the same time. That was the kind of problem diplomacy existed to solve, and the kind that turned a misunderstanding into a casualty report. They were not shouting. They did not need to. Mediator Selun Ithra stood beside Praxin inside the Serethi mediation ring. The Serethi was tall, silver-skinned, and almost unnaturally still. His species possessed a form of consensual telepathy refined through thousands of years of diplomatic practice. He could not read private thoughts. That myth irritated Serethi professionals intensely. What he could do was carry carefully bounded impressions alongside translated language, certainty, concern, confusion, good faith, hesitation. The exact emotional distinctions that literal words often flattened. Praxin spoke into the summit channel. The Hellyric Compact proposes a 14-second delay between the Western and Central anchor groups. Does the Vadran delegation object to the delay itself, or only to the proposed sequence? The Vadran envoy answered in clicks too rapid for Praxin's anatomy to reproduce. The translator rendered the sentence. Selun supplied the rest. Not refusal, concern about timing assumptions. Praxin understood immediately. He redirected the question. The dispute dissolved in less than 2 minutes. That was what Serethi mediation did. It removed the most dangerous part of diplomacy, believing you understood someone when you did not. Across the chamber, Ambassador Carys Bellweather watched with the restrained fascination Praxin had come to expect from humans. The human delegation was small compared with the old powers. Humanity had joined the Union only recently, and controlled fewer long-range anchors than most delegations present. Carys Bellweather nevertheless carried herself like someone accustomed to rooms where a single badly chosen sentence could become tomorrow's emergency. Before entering interstellar diplomacy, she had spent years in human crisis negotiation, where nobody could feel anyone else's intent, and every important assumption had to be dragged into the open. Yet Carys had been involved in almost every technical session. She caught Praxin looking at her and smiled. Praxin had learned that exposing human teeth in this manner usually meant friendliness. Usually, humans possessed an alarming number of expressions. During a recess several hours earlier, Carys had told Selun that telepathic mediation made her uncomfortable. Selun had regarded her with equal curiosity. "You negotiate without shared intent every day," he had said. "Yes." "How?" "Badly sometimes." Selun had found that amusing. Carys continued, "We use tone, expression, context, body language. And when those disagree, we argue about what somebody really meant for the next 100 years. Selun had stared at her. Carys had shrugged. "It builds character." Now there was no humor in the chamber. A new projection appeared above the delegates. The Orison Cascade had accelerated again. Praxin felt Selun's controlled urgency settle through the mediation field. The shutdown window had narrowed. They had perhaps 4 hours. Resume final sequencing, Praxin ordered. The Serethi network connected. Delegates leaned toward their terminals. Translation channels opened. Then Selûne screamed. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. A strangled sound escaped him as he dropped to one knee. Across the chamber, every Serethi mediator reacted. Some grabbed their heads. One collapsed completely. The transparent mediation field flickered. Praxin felt the subtle presence that had surrounded the summit vanish, not weaken, disappear. Selûne. The Serethi looked up. His eyes were wide. I cannot hear them. Praxin glanced around the chamber. Delegates were already rising. What happened? I cannot hear anyone. The chamber translation system stuttered. Words became fragments, then nonsense. Praxin's console filled with error messages. Semantic reference network unavailable. Subspace context lattice unavailable. Emergency lexical translation only. Hundreds of delegates began speaking at once. Some languages still translated partially, others did not. A booming vibration rolled across one side of the chamber. Lights flashed from another delegation. Praxin raised his voice. Remain calm. Half the chamber could not understand him. Above them, the Orison clock continued counting down. Chapter 2. Silence. Praxin had never appreciated how noisy misunderstanding was. The Xylo's emergency systems restored local power within seconds. Life support remained stable. Doors functioned. Basic visual displays worked. The summit building itself had suffered no physical damage, yet diplomacy collapsed almost instantly. The Orison disturbance had struck the same subspace infrastructure used by the summit's high-bandwidth semantic translators. The surviving backup software could translate simple vocabulary between some species. It could not manage specialized legal language, context-dependent grammar, cultural modifiers, or languages based partly on color, vibration, scent, or spatial positioning. The Serethi network was worse, gone completely. Praxin helped Selûne stand. What do you perceive? My own mind. Selûne's voice shook. Praxin had never heard that before. For a Serethi mediator, isolation was not simply absence of information. Their professional lives were built around controlled connection. Every negotiation began with the expectation that emotional context could be confirmed rather than guessed. Selûne had spent decades learning how to distinguish fear from deceit, uncertainty from evasion, anger from intent to harm. Now all of those distinctions had vanished at once. The delegates around him still possessed faces, voices, postures, and movements, but to Selûne they had become painfully incomplete signals. Selûne looked around the room like a creature waking in darkness. I can see them, he said. I know intellectually that they are distressed, but there is nothing beneath it. Praxin touched the mediator's arm. Can the network recover? I do not know. That answer frightened Praxin more than anything else. Selûne always knew. Around them, summit staff attempted emergency procedures. Delegates were separated into linguistic compatibility groups. Local translation engines were reset. Technical teams searched for unaffected frequencies. Nothing restored the shared semantic layer. Praxin contacted the Orison engineering team through a hardwired local link. Their message was simple enough for the remaining systems to deliver. The cascade had caused the communication failure. It was still worsening. Time remaining before synchronized shutdown became impossible, approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. Praxin looked over the chamber. 3 hours, 300 delegates, 17 major anchor authorities, no shared language reliable enough for final consent. Selûne sat at an auxiliary station, trying repeatedly to establish telepathic contact. Nothing. At last, he looked at Praxin. We must suspend the summit. Praxin hated the words. Can we establish direct linguistic groups? Not enough of them. The agreement must be understood by every anchor authority. We have the technical plan. We had a draft plan. Selûne pointed toward the central display. 3 delegations still had unresolved objections. Others had not certified final sequencing. If they act on incomplete understanding, we could make the cascade worse. Praxin knew he was correct. Union diplomatic law existed for reasons written in blood. Before Serethi certification became standard, mistranslated concessions and falsely inferred threats had ended negotiations, collapsed alliances, and in 2 infamous cases started shooting wars. Praxin had no contempt for the safeguard. He trusted it precisely because he knew what existed before it. No government could be bound to a civilization-level infrastructure shutdown unless its representative understood the action and gave verifiable consent. Serethi certification normally provided that verification. Without it, the summit had no legal foundation. Across the chamber, Carys Bellweather had abandoned the human delegation table and was examining one of the emergency displays. She spoke to a Xylos technician. The technician's translator produced only fragments. Carys changed tactics. She pointed at the display, then at a light, then at another screen. The technician responded with gestures. Praxin watched. The human turned toward him. She crossed the chamber. Praxin's translator managed her first sentence. Displays functioning. Yes. Static graphics. Yes. Local tablets. Yes. She pointed toward the chamber lights. Colors. Praxin nodded automatically. Carys' eyes narrowed. Then she pointed at him, at his head. At the motion he had just made, Praxin became self-conscious. Carys spoke slowly. Line of sight works. Yes. She looked around the chamber. Delegates were confused, frightened, separated by language and biology. Selûne said something in Serethi that the translator failed to process. Carys looked at the clock, then back at Praxin. Then we're not silent. Praxin stared at her. He had negotiated with humans long enough to recognize confidence. He had also learned that human confidence did not necessarily mean they knew what they were doing. Sometimes it meant they intended to discover the answer very quickly. Carys held up one finger. Praxin expected a speech. Humans seemed culturally incapable of resisting speeches when stakes became large enough. Carys gave him none. She looked at the room, then deliberately reduced her ambition from 300 delegates to the single person standing in front of her. One person. She pointed at Praxin, then at herself. Start. Chapter 3. 1 bit. Carys borrowed a tablet from a summit technician. She cleared the display, then drew a green circle. Under it, she drew a red bar. Praxin watched her. She pointed to the green circle, then lowered her head and raised it. Once. Praxin stared. She did it again. Green circle, head down, head up. Then she pointed toward him. Praxin understood that part. You want me to repeat the movement? The translator produced enough of the sentence that she smiled. Praxin lowered his head and raised it. Carys immediately pointed to the green circle. Yes. The word survived translation. She pointed at Praxin, then nodded. Yes. Praxin repeated the nod. Carys nodded back. He felt ridiculous. Then she touched the red bar. She turned her head slowly from side to side. Red, side to side. She pointed at Praxin. He copied it. No, Carys said. The translator caught that too. Praxin looked at the screen. Green, yes. Red, no. Carys added an open palm facing outward. She held it there. Then pointed at the word stop in Xylos script, which the tablet could still display locally. Praxin copied the open palm. Stop. Then Carys touched 2 fingers beneath her eyes and pointed toward the screen. Look, she repeated it. Praxin followed. He saw what she was constructing. You are assigning meanings to motions. Carys heard only part of his sentence. She pointed at him, then herself. Then the green circle nodded. Praxin nodded back. Yes, shared meaning established, not assumed. Established. Praxin turned toward Selûne. The Serethi mediator watched from several meters away. His expression was unreadable without telepathic context. Carys beckoned him closer. Selûne hesitated, then approached. She repeated the lesson. Green, nod, yes, red, head movement, no, open palm, stop. Selûne learned faster than Praxin had. When he finished, Carys pointed toward a nearby Hellyric delegate. The Hellyric's neck was too rigid for a human-style nod. Carys attempted the demonstration anyway. The delegate responded by lowering one of 4 arms. Carys stopped. She considered, then pointed at the green circle again. She raised one hand. The Hellyric lifted one arm. Carys pointed to green, then at the raised arm. The Hellyric repeated it. Yes. For no, the Hellyric used 2 arms crossed. Carys pointed at the red bar. The Hellyric crossed both upper arms. Red, no. Praxin felt the first flicker of understanding. The gesture itself was irrelevant. What mattered was the agreement about what the gesture meant. Within 10 minutes, the nearest 6 delegations had a signal for yes and a signal for no. The first successes spread because they were visible. Delegates who could not understand Carys' words could still watch the sequence. Symbol, demonstration, repeat back, confirmation. Once they grasped the procedure, they began teaching neighboring delegations themselves. The human idea stopped depending on humans almost immediately, which Praxin recognized as the first sign that it might actually scale. Within 15, summit technicians began distributing colored cards and simple display icons. Praxin watched a species with no visible limbs flash a green skin pattern after Carys trained them. Another delegation used a body tilt. One used a single bright light for yes and two dim pulses for no. There was no universal body language, and the humans had not discovered one. They were doing something more methodical. Teach a signal, have it repeated back, confirm the shared meaning, and only then use it. Carys returned to Praxin. She pointed at the Orison clock, then at the delegates, then nodded. Praxin understood. Continue, he nodded. The summit began again. Chapter 4. Did you mean yes? The first mistake nearly destroyed the protocol, and afterward Praxin understood why Carys had insisted on teaching each signal instead of merely demonstrating it. A gesture could be simple without being obvious. The difference between those two ideas was suddenly life and death important. An Uthri envoy lowered its head after Praxin displayed a proposed anchor shutdown sequence. Several humans interpreted the motion as agreement. Carys did not. She stepped between the tables and raised the stop signal. Open palm, everything nearby froze. The Uthri envoy lowered its head again, then again. A Xylos xenobiologist rushed over with a local reference database. The Uthri movement did not mean yes, it indicated confusion. Praxin felt cold. If Carys had treated the motion as universal, they might have recorded false consent within the first half hour. Instead, she erased the mark beside the Uthri delegation. Then she walked directly to them. She pointed to the green card, raised one finger. Waited, the Uthri possessed manipulators. The envoy raised one. Carys pointed to green. The envoy raised the same digit again, yes established. For no, they chose a closed hand. Praxin watched the exchange carefully. When she returned, he said, "Your gesture is not universal." Her translator caught enough. Carys gave him an incredulous look. Obviously. Praxin almost laughed. She pointed at herself and nodded, then at the Uthri and raised one finger. Different forms, same agreed meaning. Selûne approached. His voice came through the weakened translator in fragments. "This is dangerously crude." Carys looked at him. "Yes." Selûne blinked. He had expected resistance. She continued slowly. "So we make it careful." Then she demonstrated something new. She pointed at Praxin, gave the yes signal. He nodded. Carys then touched her ear, although Praxin knew hearing itself was not the point. She tapped the tablet where she had written. Received, then she pointed at another symbol. Two green circles, agreed. Praxin frowned. Carys displayed a sample instruction, Anchor 4. Shutdown time marker. She pointed to it, then at Praxin. He nodded once. Carys immediately raised the stop signal. She pointed at the word received, single nod, then it agreed. She nodded twice deliberately, down and up, pause, down and up again. Praxin understood. Knowing I received the message is not the same as knowing I consent. Carys smiled as enough of his sentence reached her. Exactly. Selûne stared at the symbols. Praxin looked at him. You approve. Selûne hesitated, then almost reluctantly nodded once. Received, Carys waited. Selûne's mouth twitched. He nodded twice. Agreed. Praxin laughed. It was the first good sound in the chamber since the silence began. Chapter 5. Pictures before words. The humans ruined the summit's visual displays, and Praxin meant that as praise. The original interface had been designed for diplomats. Elegant gradients, layered menus, dynamic legal annotations, context-sensitive translation fields. Carys ordered most of it removed. Human technicians worked with Xylos system staff to rebuild the chamber displays around pictures and stable symbols. The Orison network appeared as a map. Major anchor clusters were represented by colored nodes. A pulsing red wave showed the cascade. A simple clock showed the proposed shutdown window. Animations demonstrated the danger of asynchronous disconnection. When one network vanished too early, the remaining nodes brightened as the simulated resonance concentrated through them. When all major clusters disconnected in sequence, the red wave weakened. Praxin watched delegates begin to understand, not perfectly, enough to ask questions. A representative would point at an anchor. Then display the stop signal. A technical specialist would walk over, adjust the diagram, and repeat the sequence. The delegate would signal receipt. Sometimes consent followed, sometimes it did not. Numbers were easier. Navigation mathematics already used standardized symbolic conventions across Union space. Time references had a common astronomical base. For once, centuries of bureaucratic standardization felt heroic. Humanity had not invented the common astronomical clock or the navigation symbols. The humans simply recognized that anything already shared was precious and refused to waste bandwidth rebuilding what the Union still possessed. Selûne remained beside Praxin. He had stopped trying to restore telepathic contact every few minutes. Instead, he watched. "What do you think?" Praxin asked. The translator managed the short question. Selûne looked toward Carys. She was teaching a delegate from a luminescent species to distinguish acknowledgement from approval by using one flash versus two. Selûne spoke carefully. "My profession attempts to preserve nuance." Praxin nodded. The humans seemed determined to destroy it. Selûne looked at him. Praxin gestured toward the room. "And yet they are communicating." Selûne considered the statement, then used the single nod. Received. Praxin smiled. The process was painfully slow, and that was its strength. Every step required confirmation. Every uncertain symbol stopped the conversation until everyone involved understood it. There were no elegant shortcuts. No telepathic context. No assumption that the other person probably meant what you thought. The humans seemed almost suspicious of smooth communication. Carys explained why when Praxin asked through a functioning local language pair. "Humans have a phrase," she said. "Assumption is the mother of a lot of disasters." The translator omitted part of that sentence. "Probably for the best." Praxin looked at the clock. 2 hours remained. The summit had rebuilt enough communication to discuss the shutdown sequence. Then Envoy Hadrasa Quill refused it. Chapter 6. The Missing Question. Hadrasa represented the Thorin Transit Assembly, one of the largest anchor authorities in Union space. Her network connected 72 inhabited systems. Without it, the shutdown could not be synchronized safely. Praxin displayed the current plan. One by one, major delegations gave acknowledgement. Several moved to consent. Hadrasa did not. Her species communicated partly through speech and partly through shifting patterns along 2 delicate throat membranes. The backup translator could not interpret the visual component. She pointed at her network, then gave her established no signal, a flattened hand against the table. Praxin tried to clarify. The translator failed. He pointed to the synchronized shutdown, then to her anchor. Hadrasa gave no again. Other delegates became visibly agitated. One pounded a forelimb against the table. Another flashed a warning pattern. Praxin raised the stop signal. Carys was already moving. She walked to Hadrasa's table and sat opposite her. No speech. Carys pointed to the main diagram, then Hadrasa's anchor cluster. Hadrasa pressed her hand flat. No. Carys nodded once. Received. She did not argue. Instead, she turned both palms upward, a human question gesture. Hadrasa stared. Carys pointed to the anchor, then to Hadrasa, then opened her hands again. Why, for several seconds, nothing happened. Then Hadrasa pulled a tablet toward herself. She drew the anchor cluster, then several lines leading outward. Along those lines, she drew small shapes. Ships. Praxin leaned closer. Hadrasa tapped the ships, then the shutdown marker, then made a sweeping motion outward. One ship's shape vanished, then another. Carys' face changed. She pointed at the ships, then at the active transit lines. Hadrasa gave the yes signal. Carys pointed to the shutdown time, then drew the ships beyond the anchor. Hadrasa gave no, still in transit. Praxin understood. Convoys. The translator caught the word. Hadrasa's eyes snapped toward him. She gave the yes signal. Once acknowledged, Carys drew several more ship icons. Hadrasa added numbers. Navigation specialists gathered. The scale of the problem became clear. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were currently moving through Thorin anchor space. If the network shut down at the originally proposed time, several convoys could emerge into disconnected corridors without functioning navigation references. The danger was not theoretical. Hadrasa had not been obstructing the summit. She had been protecting hundreds of thousands of civilians whom the rest of the room had not yet understood were part of the equation. Praxin felt ashamed of his earlier frustration. He had seen refusal. He had not known the question. Carys looked at him, then tapped the open palm symbol she had just established. Praxin understood her point. They needed more than yes and no. They needed why. Chapter 7. The Quiet Negotiation. The next 40 minutes became the strangest negotiation Praxin had ever presided over, conducted with almost no mutually intelligible speech. Hadrasa drew convoy paths. Xylo's engineers drew anchor boundaries. Human navigation specialists added timing marks. Carys moved between groups carrying tablets because the main displays could not show every revision simultaneously. The problem was difficult. Thorin anchors could remain active slightly longer than originally planned. But only if 2 neighboring transit networks disconnected in a different order, absorbing part of the temporary load. Those governments would carry additional risk. Their delegates had to understand that risk. Carys took the revised diagram to the first delegation. She pointed at the old sequence, then the new. The representative studied both, pointed at the increased load. A human engineer drew a tolerance bar. The representative pointed to it. Then to the revised time. The engineer nodded. The representative gave one acknowledgement signal. Not consent. Carys waited. The representative asked another question using the open palms gesture. More calculations. Then finally the representative gave the consent signal twice. Carys moved to the second government. By then her movements had changed. She no longer looked like the senior ambassador who had entered the summit that morning. She looked like a crisis negotiator working a line of stubborn, frightened people one problem at a time. No wasted motion, no assumption that urgency excused confusion, and no attempt to make anyone agree before they understood what agreement would cost them. They refused. Praxen's stomach tightened. The refusal was not emotional. Their anchor cluster had already reported overheating in 2 field stabilizers. Additional load could cause damage. The engineers adjusted again. A third network could take part of the strain if it delayed shutdown by 3 seconds. Another delegate had to consent. Carys crossed the chamber. Praxen watched the plan evolve physically from table to table. No speeches, no threats, no appeals to solidarity. A diagram changed. Someone pointed. Someone shook a head. Engineers recalculated. Someone asked why. Another symbol appeared. Acknowledgement. Consent. The plan moved. Selûne stood beside Praxen, silent. At one point he whispered, "I would normally feel whether Hadrasa believed the risk was tolerable." Praxen watched Hadrasa inspect the newest timing model. "What do you have instead?" "Her behavior." "Is that enough?" Selûne looked uncomfortable. "I do not know." Hadrasa pointed at her civilian convoys, then at the revised sequence. She gave the yes signal once, received, then twice. Consent. Carys exhaled. Praxen realized she had been holding her breath. Humans apparently possessed no special immunity to uncertainty. Carys had been afraid of getting the answer wrong too. She simply kept working inside that uncertainty until everyone could verify the same answer. The Orison clock showed 52 minutes. The technical plan was finally complete. The law was not. Chapter 8. The clock. Selûne made one final attempt to restore the mediation field. Praxen stood beside him. The Serethi closed his eyes, his breathing slowed. The surrounding field generators activated. Nothing happened. No shared impressions, no emotional context, no verification layer. Selûne opened his eyes. "I cannot certify the summit." Praxen looked toward the delegates. "That makes the agreement invalid." "Yes, even if every representative has confirmed the same sequence. Under existing law, the Serethi mediator certifies informed interspecies consent when semantic uncertainty is significant." Praxen knew the statute. He had helped revise it 12 years earlier. At the time, it had seemed obvious. Civilization-level decisions should not depend on imperfect machine translation. Now the safeguard itself threatened to stop the only available solution. Praxen walked to the central platform. Carys joined him. He pointed to Selûne, then to the certification symbol. Then gave the no signal. Carys understood. Her expression hardened. She pointed around the chamber, at the diagrams, at the confirmation logs, at each delegation. Praxen nodded once. Yes, he saw. She pointed to Selûne again, then to the delegates. Question, did they understand? Praxen turned toward the mediator. The translator could still handle a simple sentence between Xylos and Serethi. "Do you believe they understand what they have agreed to?" Selûne looked around the chamber. Hadrasa was checking the final convoy timing. The Hellyric delegation had repeated its anchor sequence 3 times. The Uthari had requested clarification until their engineers could independently reproduce the shutdown model. Every major power possessed the same timing plan. Everyone had demonstrated it back. Everyone had separately marked consent. Selûne had spent his life feeling certainty through a channel built specifically to carry it. Now he had only evidence, repeated instructions, independent reconstruction, explicit questions, and deliberate consent. Praxen waited. Selûne looked at Carys, then at the tablet containing the first green circle she had drawn. The Serethi slowly lowered his head, raised it. A single nod. Praxen understood. Yes. Selûne reached for the certification console. "This is outside precedent." Praxen said, "Everything today is outside precedent." Selûne entered an emergency certification under his own authority. Understanding verified by repeatback and explicit visual consent. It would be argued over for decades if they survived. The clock reached 43 minutes. Praxen opened the final vote. Chapter 9. The vote. The chamber became almost completely still. The silence no longer felt like failure. Hours earlier, it had meant the loss of everything that made interspecies diplomacy possible. Now it meant every delegate was looking at the same plan and waiting for the same deliberately defined signals. Carys stood at the central display. Behind her, the complete shutdown sequence glowed in clean colors. 17 major anchor networks. Each had a designated shutdown time. Each included tolerance margins. The Thorin network remained active slightly longer to allow Hadras's civilian convoys to clear. 2 neighboring networks changed sequence to compensate. 3 others adjusted by seconds. The plan was ugly, adjusted by seconds and patched around real constraints, but every delegation understood the version now glowing behind Carys. Carys pointed to the first network, then the timing marker, then its delegate. The representative acknowledged, then consented. The next network followed. Praxin went third. He studied the Xylos sequence one final time. The consequences were enormous. Shutting the anchors would isolate several colonies for days. Commercial traffic would stop. Emergency reserves would be consumed. If the timing was wrong, lives would be lost. He looked at Carys. She did not urge him. She simply waited. Praxin lowered his head once, acknowledged, then again, consent. Across the chamber, other species answered in their own ways. One raised an arm once, then twice. Another flashed green, paused, then flashed green again. A species without limbs shifted its entire body forward in 2 deliberate movements. No one laughed. In less than 3 hours, motions that had begun as improvised teaching aids had acquired the seriousness of signatures because everyone knew the procedure behind them. Hadrasa remained. 16 networks had consented. The 17th had not. The clock showed 38 minutes. Praxin watched her. Hadrasa studied the convoy timing. An engineer beside her pointed at a projected arrival marker. 1 convoy had just crossed the first safe boundary. 2 remained. The revised shutdown gave them enough margin. Barely, Carys stood motionless. Praxin felt the entire chamber waiting with her. Hadrasa looked at the map, then at Carys. She raised her hand, flattened it against the table. No, several delegates shifted. Praxin's heart tightened. Hadrasa pointed at 1 timing marker, then moved it slightly. A question. Carys looked to the engineers. Calculations appeared. The timing could move by half a second without breaking the adjacent network's tolerance. Carys updated the diagram. Hadrasa studied it, then lowered her head once. Praxin almost reacted. Carys did not. Acknowledgement only. Hadrasa raised her head, paused, then nodded again, and once more, consent. The chamber erupted into motion, not cheering, work. Delegates rushed to communications stations. Engineers opened hardened channels. Technicians began transmitting the sequence. The summit had an agreement. 36 minutes remained to make the galaxy obey it. Chapter 10. Execute. The sophisticated communications network was useless, so the human technicians deliberately reduced the problem to simpler channels. Praxin found this increasingly reassuring. They did not seem embarrassed by losing capability. They simply asked what still worked. Long-range semantic channels failed unpredictably under the Orison interference. Complex packets arrived corrupted. High-density translation references vanished, so the humans stripped the messages down. Anchor identifier. Time, action, sequence, acknowledge, repeat. The first transmission contained almost no language, a code for the receiving network, a standardized astronomical timestamp, a shutdown symbol, a checksum. The receiving station returned the same information. Then the summit confirmed. Carys showed Praxin the process. He pointed toward the tiny packet. That is enough. For execution, if both sides already know the plan, yes. And if they do not, then we stop. There was that signal again, stop. Humans treated uncertainty almost like a physical hazard. If a return signal differed from the transmitted one, they did not smooth over the discrepancy or assume the recipient had understood the intended message. They stopped, retransmitted, and forced the system back to a known state. Praxin recognized the logic from engineering fault control. Carys had imported it into diplomacy. One network failed its repeat back. The summit did not assume it was a transmission error. They sent again. The second packet returned correctly. Confirmed, another government could receive but not transmit through its normal relay. A human communications officer found an old low-bandwidth emergency carrier used for rescue beacons. The signal was slow. It worked. Praxin watched anchor networks turn amber on the main display. Amber meant instructions received. Green meant sequence confirmed. One by one, the map changed. The nod had escaped the chamber, not as anatomy but as architecture. Send something simple. Confirm that it was received. Confirm that the recipient agreed. Only then act. Selûne stood beside Praxin. He watched the map. I used to think human communication was impoverished. Praxin looked at him, and now. Selûne considered, it is. Praxin stared, the Serethi continued. You appear to have compensated by becoming obsessive. Praxin laughed. Carys was close enough to hear the translation. She pointed at Selûne, then gave him a double nod. He returned it. The clock reached 19 minutes. 16 networks showed green. 1 remained dark. Chapter 11. The Last Network. The Delphic Reach controlled only 4% of the major anchor network. In a coupled system, 4% was enough to kill millions if it remained active at the wrong moment. Its primary communication relay had failed completely. The summit could transmit toward it through a narrow emergency carrier. Nothing returned. Praxin stared at the black icon. Can they receive us? A human technician answered through the surviving translation link. Unknown. Can we reach a secondary station? Trying. Hadrasa pointed to the countdown. 14 minutes. The synchronized shutdown had to begin soon. If the Delphic Reach remained active, the Cascade could concentrate through its anchors while neighboring systems disconnected. Praxin imagined the network glowing under impossible load. Stations rupturing. Transit corridors collapsing. Carys leaned over the human communications console. What bandwidth? The technician answered, terrible. Maybe a few dozen stable bits before the carrier drifts. Enough. For what? Carys pulled up the final plan. She removed almost everything. The message became 4 pieces: Delphic Anchor Identifier, Shutdown Time, Shutdown Symbol, Consent Confirmation Marker. Praxin watched her add one final graphic, a tiny simplified head, down, up, the human nod. He looked at her. Why? If their delegates sent anything before their relay failed, their stations may have received the summit protocol. You are assuming. No. She pointed at the transmitter. We're testing. The packet went out. Nothing. 10 seconds. 20. The clock dropped below 12 minutes. The technician adjusted the carrier frequency. Sent again. Static. A third attempt. Then the receiver chirped. A tiny packet arrived. Corrupted. The human technician swore. Carys said again. They transmitted. The distant station responded. 4 symbols appeared. The anchor identifier, correct. The shutdown time, correct. The shutdown symbol, correct. Then the tiny graphic, head down, head up. Praxin felt something constrict in his chest. They understood. Carys shook her head. Not yet. She pointed to the acknowledgement rule. 1 signal meant received. The distant station had sent 1. Carys transmitted the consent marker again, then waited. 5 seconds. 7. The reply arrived. The nod symbol, twice. Praxin closed his eyes. Consent. On the main display, the Delphic Reach turned green. All 17 networks were ready. Praxin looked across the chamber and realized that no one had restored the system they had lost. They had built a smaller one beneath it, crude in bandwidth and astonishingly strict about verification. It could not carry poetry, subtle insult, reassurance, or the 1,000 shades of intense Selûne normally moved through a room. It could carry enough truth to act together. Carys looked toward Praxin. The final authority belonged to him. He lowered his head once, then again, execute. Chapter 12. The Cascade breaks. Across the galaxy, transit anchors began shutting down. Praxin watched entire regions disappear from the navigation display. Normally, losing even one major anchor would have triggered emergency procedures. Now hundreds vanished according to plan. The Western networks went first, then the outer central clusters. The Thorin system remained active while Hadrasa's final convoy cleared. Praxin watched the convoy marker crawl across the safe boundary. Hadrasa did not move. The moment it crossed, she gave the shutdown signal. Her network went dark. The cascade surged. For one terrible instant, every remaining active anchor brightened on the display. Praxin gripped the edge of the dais. An engineer shouted. The translator produced only fragments. Load rising, expected, hold. The next anchor cluster disconnected. Then another. The red resonance wave contracted. The Delphic Reach remained active until its designated second. Praxin counted. 3, 2, 1, its anchors vanished. The main display went almost black. For several seconds, the galaxy's greatest transit network ceased to exist. No one spoke. Then the Orison monitoring layer updated. The red wave slowed, its amplitude dropped. Another update, lower. The runaway feedback had lost the coupled structure sustaining it. The cascade was dying. There was no explosion and no brilliant flash, only numbers moving in the right direction. Praxin had never loved numbers more. Someone in the chamber raised an arm. A Hellyric yes. Another delegate flashed green. Then another, a body tilted, a hand rose. Across the chamber, species began using the signals they had learned over the previous hours. Acknowledged, safe, understood. Praxin looked toward Hadrasa. She stared at the convoy marker. It had emerged safely. She closed her eyes, then nodded twice toward Carys. Carys returned the gesture. Selûne stood silently beside Praxin. The Serethi mediation field remained dead. Praxin found that, for the moment, he did not miss it. Chapter 13. After the silence, the telepathic network returned 11 hours later. Selûne felt it first. Praxin was in the emergency coordination chamber reviewing anchor restart plans when the Serethi suddenly stopped moving. His eyes closed. A shudder passed through him. Praxin stood. Selûne. The mediator lifted one hand. Wait. The human stop signal had already become habit. Then Selûne inhaled sharply. Praxin felt the first brush of mediated presence touch his mind. Controlled. Familiar. Gentle relief flooded through it. Selûne opened his eyes. I can hear them. Praxin smiled. Around the chamber, Serethi mediators reconnected one by one. The sophisticated translation network followed more slowly. Language returned. Nuance returned. Intent returned. Delegates who had spent hours communicating with colors and gestures could suddenly speak freely again. The result was chaos. Everyone talked at once. Praxin actually missed the silence. Carys approached. Her translator rendered her voice perfectly. Well, that's easier. Selûne regarded her. Yes. Carys paused, then laughed. You know, you just nodded. Selûne went very still. Praxin looked away to conceal amusement. The formal aftermath began. Anchor networks could not restart immediately. Engineers needed to inspect them for resonance damage. Thousands of civilian ships required rerouting. Several colonies would face temporary shortages. The crisis was not over, but the catastrophe had been prevented. No major anchor had failed. Hadrasa's convoys survived. The Delphic Reach reported that its local station had indeed received portions of the summit's emergency gesture protocol before the relay collapsed. The station commander had recognized the nod symbol. Once. Received. Twice. Agreed. Praxin read the report twice, then forwarded it to the legal committee. They would need it. There was going to be an enormous argument about what had happened. That, at least, felt reassuringly normal. Chapter 14. Received. The Galactic Union debated the emergency protocol for months. Praxin attended more hearings than he cared to remember. Some delegates argued that the improvised signals had been too crude for civilization-level decisions. Others pointed out that civilization still existed partly because those crude signals had worked. The Serethi Guild supported reform. Selûne argued hardest against anyone who described the reform as replacing telepathic mediation. The emergency protocol could not do what the Serethi did, and he refused to let politicians learn the wrong lesson from one successful crisis. Its value was precisely that it survived a failure mode the primary system did not. That surprised several governments. It did not surprise Selûne. Redundancy is not an insult to the primary system, he told the High Council. Praxin suspected a human had helped him phrase that. The resulting regulation was deliberately narrow. Every major diplomatic facility would maintain a line-of-sight emergency communication protocol independent of telepathy, semantic translation, or subspace networking. Each delegation would establish compatible signals during registration. At minimum. Attention received. Yes, no, stop. Question, repeat. Consent, numeric confirmation. Species unable to perform the default gestures would declare alternatives. The human nod became the recommended visual signal for acknowledgement and consent where anatomy permitted. 1 nod, received. 2, agreed. Nobody claimed the movement was naturally universal. It had become a shared convention because everyone involved remembered the crisis in which its meaning had been taught, repeated, confirmed, and trusted. Months later, Praxin presided over another summit in the same chamber. The Serethi network functioned perfectly. Translation systems had been rebuilt with additional local redundancy. Every word carried nuance. Every uncertainty could be examined. Selûne stood once again beside Praxin inside the mediation ring. The chamber felt whole. Carys entered late. Humanity, Praxin had learned, possessed a complicated relationship with punctuality. Selûne noticed her immediately. Through the restored mediation field, Praxin felt the Serethi's amusement. He could have greeted Carys telepathically through the consensual channel. He could have spoken. Instead, Selûne caught her eye across the chamber. He slowly lowered his head, raised it. Carys stopped. Her smile appeared, then she nodded back. Praxin watched from the dais. The most sophisticated diplomatic communication system in known space surrounded them. Nobody needed the gesture anymore, they used it anyway.